First of all, let me just say thank you to Dean Shepard and to Director Borders and Professor Gutierrez, who, what Lori didn't tell you when she was doing the introduction is we're all three former AERA presidents. We're all three in the National Academy. It's sort of like just a girls' club, right? But I am truly honored to be here. And I'm really honored to be among these outstanding teachers. I am both honored and humbled to be here with you. In 2008, I actually won our university's highest teaching award, the Hilldale Award, and we give 4 of them out for distinguished teaching and service. And the year that I received the award, we give one out for each of our divisions. Our university is divided into 4 divisions: biological and life sciences, arts and humanities, physical sciences, and social sciences. So I won the social science award. But I'm sitting in the audience as they're calling the people up, and everybody else was really, really, really old. And they were all getting ready to retire. So I looked at my chair, I said, what are you trying to say? But it was quite an honor. And I do also have to say a lot of my talk was already covered in the video. Just listening to colleagues from across this campus talk about what they do. So I hope I'm not too redundant. But I've called the talk Getting Serious About Education, Cultivating Culturally Relevant Teachers for New Century Students. About 8 years ago, my daughter was entering her senior year of high school, and our home was inundated with the modern phenomenon of the college or university view book. Given her strong PSAT and SAT scores, she was sought out by many high-quality institutions. On the other hand, my sons, much older than their sister, were not wooed in the same way. One was an athlete, and so he received all of his school contacts via football coaches, inevitably going on to Oregon State to play football. And the other was quite fortunate to be able to go to any school, but settle on one of the local California state universities. We lived in California at the time. However, in the case of my daughter, each day, a new set of glossy catalogs arrived, advertising the wonders of the schools. We learned the number of Nobel laureates, or the booming construction of new laboratories, or the wonderful student-teacher ratios. And just looking at these view books made me want to go back to school. She received so many view books that we had to create a hanging file to keep them straight. One day, she received a view book from the University of Colorado Boulder. And unlike most of the others, this one sat on our kitchen island for days, instead of being perused and then placed in a file box. So after more than 2 weeks of passing by the Colorado View book on my kitchen island, I finally asked her, aren't you even going to look at this view book? It's been sitting in the same place for weeks. At that moment, she looked at me and declared, oh, those people aren't serious about education. They're just selling mountains. It's a 17-year-old. Now, I know enough about UC Boulder to know it is indeed a serious educational institution. And it is serendipitous and, of course, convenient that the Colorado View book sits at the center of this introduction. But her statement, those people aren't serious about education, provides an important rubric for thinking about how we might begin to prepare teachers for better serving what I call new century students. And I think we have to prove to students that we are indeed serious about education. More than 20 years ago, I began investigating teachers who were successful with those students who we think of as miserable failures in our current schools, African American students. And I came to call this work culturally relevant pedagogy. It serves as a theoretical construct for explaining the kind of education that is more likely to ensure the success of most students. So it's interesting because people always say, oh, well, you were studying African American students. Actually, no, I was studying students. It turned out that I used African Americans and made them normative, which is almost never done in the literature. They're almost always the outliers. And my argument is if we can get it right for these kids, then we're likely to be able to get it right for most kids. So this notion of culturally relevant pedagogy involves three propositions: supporting student learning, developing cultural competence, and encouraging socio-political consciousness. So I want to briefly discuss what I mean by each of these, and then talk about how they apply not only to K-12 students, but to those who we want to cultivate as teachers, who can implement culturally relevant teaching in the classroom. The first proposition appears so obvious that it might seem unnecessary to even talk about. But I want to make the point that much of what happens in classrooms, especially college and university classrooms, has little to do with what students learn. Instead, the focus is on what teachers cover. And many of my colleagues are proud that a certain number of their students do not pass their courses. They associate a high failure rate with increased rigor. They see their courses as sieves that only allow a small percentage of the students to get through. But a culturally relevant approach sees student learning as the goal for every student. And rather than creating a sieve, culturally relevant teachers create a net designed to catch all the students. The goal is not coverage, it's mastery. One of the tasks of a course that I offer entitled Culturally Relevant Pedagogy is to go observe teaching in some place other than the School of Education. And my presumption, and maybe it's a wrong presumption, is that people in colleges of education have at least done some teaching. But that may not be the case, I realize that. But so that I don't have to put anybody on blast, I basically say, you have to go outside the School of Education. And so they're encouraged to go to other professional schools, to the law school, to the business school, to the medical school, and other parts of the university, the College of Letters and Sciences, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. I even encourage them to look at teaching in non-traditional settings, such as a swim class, or Tai Chi, or yoga, or athletic coaching. This past spring, one of my students, and this is a first, did her observation of teaching in the medical school's cadaver lab. And what she described was an excellent example of a teacher who was focused on mastery, not coverage. The lab was comprised of students in groups of 8, and 2 of the students had been in the lab a day earlier and completed it. And this lab was on the renal system. Their task was to teach the renal system to the other 6 students. The medical professor and a mortician were also in the lab, observing and moving from group to group, but they didn't say anything. The 2 student teachers were detailed and meticulous about their teaching, quizzing the students in their group throughout and checking to make sure every student fully understood the renal system. The reason that the students were so careful with their group members was that the medical professor would eventually choose 2 of the students in their group to take the lab exam for the entire group. The grade these 2 students received would be averaged and given to everyone in the group. The medical school is looking for maximum competence for its soon-to-be doctors, not coverage from its professors. What might it mean for us to develop teachers who demanded this kind of high performance from all of their students? The second component of culturally relevant pedagogy is perhaps the most misunderstood. Because when I use this term, I'm referring to one's ability to be firmly grounded in his or her culture of origin and fluent in at least one other culture. For most students of color, this generally means that they develop a deep understanding and appreciation of their own heritage, history, language, and customs, while also accessing the mainstream culture. White middle-class students are not exempt from developing cultural competence. And although schools typically cater directly to their culture, they too need to become fluent in at least one other culture. In an ideal world, all students would leave school multiculturally competent, to be able to deal facilely with the cosmopolitan global world in which they will find themselves. At a minimum, every student should leave school at least biculturally competent. But how do we develop culturally competent students if our teachers are culturally incompetent? The third component of culturally relevant pedagogy, socio-political consciousness, is perhaps the most ignored. Teachers understand the need to ensure student learning, and indeed some are sympathetic to supporting students' cultural competence. However, the idea of helping students engage directly in the social and civic concerns of their schools, communities, localities, the nation, and the world seem beyond the scope of classroom teachers. In plain English, I think of this component as the so what factor. Students regularly ask us why they have to learn particular things, and we regularly respond with, because you're going to need this one day. By about 4th or 5th grade, they realize we're lying. And those who are savvy learn, or should I say, memorize what we teach to pass our tests and to pass our classes. Those who are less plugged into education resist in ways that are detrimental to their own academic well-being. A culturally relevant approach to teaching helps students understand that their learning can be and should be connected to the everyday problems of living in a society that is deeply divided along racial, ethnic, linguistic, economic, environmental, social, political, and cultural lines. And they should be learning that education can and should help alleviate those problems and those divisions. That's the whole point that Thomas Jefferson had in mind when he talked about the need for an educated citizenry. So here I stand, more than 20 years past my first inquiries on culturally relevant pedagogy, and I find that the notion of culturally relevant pedagogy, at least my understanding and practice of it, evolving in some new and exciting ways. Those new ways are what I want to focus on in the remainder of my remarks to you. How culturally relevant pedagogy can meet the needs of new century students and their teachers, regardless of level, that is, from elementary through graduate education. So first I have a question of you, and this question is only for the teachers in the room. Students already know what your answer is, so I don't want you to answer. Teachers in the room, how many of you have Twitter accounts? Sad. Sad. Because if you are on Twitter, that's great. If you're not, you're already behind the curve with New Century students. We are looking at the most technologically astute, plugged in, globally connected generation the world has ever seen. However, when I walk into most schools, I see signs throughout admonishing the students against things like cell phone use. In fact, I attended a workshop earlier this summer in Indianapolis, and I walked into the classroom, and it had a sign on the door that said, "No cell phones, no cell phones, no cell phones." And I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs, it's not a phone, it's a computer. This totally different understanding of devices is but one example of how New Century students are different from their counterparts of earlier generations. Each year, Beloit College of Beloit, Wisconsin conducts a mindset list for its incoming freshman class. And I actually had to change this last night because the list just came out. I had last year's things in there. So last night I stuck in the class of 2016's mindset list. So I'm going to give you 10 of the 75 things that we know about the entering freshmen. They have always lived in cyberspace, addicted to a new generation of electronic narcotics. Michael Jackson's family, not the Kennedys, constitute American royalty. If they miss the Daily Show, they can always get their news on YouTube. Bill Clinton is a senior statesman of whose presidency they have little knowledge. They have never seen an airplane ticket. Women have always piloted warplanes and space shuttles. Star Wars has always been just a film, not a defense strategy. They have come to political consciousness during a time of increasing doubts about America's future. The Twilight Zone involves vampires, not Rod Serling. And they watch television everywhere, but on television. I've shared just 10 of the 75 items on the mindset list to underscore how rapidly new technologies have widened the generation gap. Aging baby boomers who have always considered themselves hip, cool, and with it struggle to connect with Generation Y students who will teach what I term New Century students. Now, while I have not conducted a scientific study of New Century students, I have made some testable observations about them as learners. And I think we have to consider these tendencies as we evaluate our teaching. They believe multitasking is an efficient way to work. And it's interesting because there was a study out last year in cognitive psychology that says, no, it's not. But that's the way they work. You know, they got the computer up, they got their handheld mobile device, they're doing a number of things at one time. They see themselves more as consumers than students. And as such, they are either purchasing an education or shopping for schools. I had a sad encounter with a student who was very upset about the grade she received. And at some point in the discussion, she said, well, I'm paying for your salary. I said, no, sweetheart, I'm subsidizing your education. you can't afford me. But that's the concept, and I worry that the university buys into the fact, this notion that they're consumers or that they're clients. No, they're students. They receive their news and information via push notices from their favorite internet sites, blogs, and programs like The Daily Show. So, if you're still an old fogey watching the CBS Evening News, they're not watching that. And although heavily invested in social justice, they are less sanguine about social welfare, particularly if they have to bear the cost. Email is an old technology, and they would prefer to communicate via instant messaging and tweets. So that's why I asked you guys about the Twitter accounts, because you're busy thinking you're all hip and with it. And I sent you guys an email. I mean, these people don't even read emails. It's just not their form. For them, library research can best be done on their desktop, which means they rarely leaf through an entire journal. They look for the article they want, they read that article. When I was in graduate school, you go get the journal, and although you may look for a specific article, you see that there's some other stuff in there that might also catch your attention. They believe it is important to stay connected. Thus, their phones are always at hand. And classes that prohibit cell phone use interrupt their connections. And they have very different conceptions of copyright, intellectual property, and plagiarism rules. We laugh at this, but this is serious stuff, because I think a lot of our students don't know that there's anything wrong with some of the things they're doing in terms of grabbing a piece of information. They're in a culture in which, if you make a song, I can take a piece of your song. It's called sampling. So if I can sample your song, why can't I sample your talk, or why can't I sample your journal article? And I offer these observations not to suggest that we have to adapt to their standards, but rather to suggest that it is important to know where they are so that we can do a better job of understanding them and assisting them in the classroom and beyond. A decade ago, when people referred to the digital divide, they were talking solely about the way social status, things like class or race or ethnicity or even gender, keep some students from accessing electronic information. However, the advent of smartphones, tablet computing, and other mobile devices have made electronic communication ubiquitous. Even in developing nations, mobile devices provide access to information and global communications in the classroom. The new digital divide is that which exists between generations. The teacher on the flip phone is unable to keep up with his or her smartphone using students, or to maintain live feeds or classroom blogs. When our students can access information and knowledge via iTunes U and other open access online classrooms, we must create more imaginative and engaging spaces in our courses. The next point will probably be the most controversial thing that I say. Hip-hop can be an important cultural vehicle for connecting with new century students. Now, before I lose the entire audience, let me be clear. I am not suggesting that the over 30 crowd should adopt the hip-hop aesthetic. Rather, the anthropologist in me believes it's important to know as much about a culture with which you work as possible. So for instance, when teaching Puerto Rican students in North Philadelphia, I began a deep and rigorous study of Puerto Rican culture and the specifics of the 2 Puerto Rican communities that made their way to Philadelphia. Knowing more about those cultures helped me plan relevant learning activities. It increased my communication with the parents, and it boosted student success. It did not make me Puerto Rican. Similarly, when I moved to California, I needed to do a similar research and study as I work with Chicano and Mexican national students. Again, knowing more about Mexican and Mexican-American culture didn't make me Mexican or Mexican-American. It made me better able to serve the needs of the students who sat in front of me each day. So today's students are in some ways, as I say, a new breed, and I've called them new century students. And because of their deep connection to hip hop, they are something like shapeshifters. They do not fit neatly into the rigid categories of race and class and gender or national origin that we've relied on to make distinctions and create hierarchy. Their sports heroes and heroines include Kobe Bryant and Jeremy Lin, Gabby Douglas and Lolo Jones. They listen to Justin Bieber, Bruno Mars, and Nicki Minaj. They are more likely to endorse same-sex marriage, and they can separate out hip-hop traditions. Where baby boomers and their parents hear it all as noise, and I just want to remind you, our parents called rock and roll and rhythm and blues noise, so now you turned into your parents. How you like that, right? But they point out that there are important differences between Lil Wayne and Immortal Technique, or Little Kim and Anna Tio. They know that this culture they have created is a mashup with permeable boundaries, and they are simultaneously sacred and profane, with deep religious convictions and an embrace of all things secular. MCs like Lupe Fiasco and Omar Offendum do not hide their Muslim faith. They work in local, national, and global contexts, with music and film about Trayvon Martin and Arab Spring, and other kinds of global issues. Hip-hop filmmaker Eli Jacobs Fantalzi makes global hip-hop films like Inventos, Hip-Hop Cubanos, and Homegrown, Hip Life in Ghana. These young people are not slackers who do not care about education. Quite the contrary. They desire to be deeply engaged in learning, but they do not want to receive a passive education where rote memorization and regurgitation passes for learning. They want to innovate, to create, and implement. And there are, as hip-hop science educator Chris Emden of Teachers College says, let me see if I can get Chris up here. That's Chris and that's Chris. They're science-minded. That's the term he has for them. And as science-minded individuals, they want to do science rather than read about it. Scholars like Jeff Duncan Andrade at San Francisco State and Patrick Kamenan of the University of San Francisco and Ernest Morrell of Teachers College, Dawn Alyssa Fisher, known as the deaf professor at San Francisco State, Elaine Richardson, AKA Dr. A of Ohio State, and Maisha Nguyen of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, understand why it's important for university scholars and researchers to stay engaged with communities and schools as teachers and community activists. Teachers College professor Mark Lamont Hill has found ways to engage media and conduct research. If you ever watch CNN, you've seen Mark, because he's often on there as a political commentator. H. Samuel Leem of Stanford University is working with hip hop in global contexts, and Sam Seidel, working with T.C. Ellis, has helped to document the work of the High School of Recording Arts in Minnesota, where students previously headed for failure gain a second chance to put their knowledge and skill in popular culture and the arts to work for both fun and profit. So I want to show you a short video about the way in which people are thinking about this notion of engaging students through hip hop. And I hope this will work.
When I was 20 years old, I started teaching at a juvenile prison. While there were many things that separated us, I quickly discovered my students and I had one big thing in common: our love of hip-hop. For the next few years, rap music became the main content for the classes I taught, and I saw disengaged students emerge as leaders and experts. Through engaging elements of hip-hop culture together, students and I learned language arts, life skills, and to love each other and ourselves more. As I continued to observe the ways in which our education system is rigged against Black and Latino students and students from low-income communities, I asked myself what else we as educators could learn from hip-hop, the insanely innovative and influential global phenomenon that has emerged from those very same communities. When I say hip-hop, I'm not just talking about music or music, graffiti, and dance, which are considered its central elements. I'm referring to the blend of instincts, confidence, and ingenuity that develops in oppressed communities, as has been demonstrated through the evolution of hip-hop culture. I'm talking about a Jamaican teenager in the South Bronx taking two records of the same song and fading back and forth between them to create a new musical composition by playing the most danceable segment over and over. I'm talking about aspiring visual artists realizing they didn't need galleries to represent them for their work to be seen, and instead painting on train cars and instantly having an audience of hundreds of thousands. I'm talking about a high school dropout from the projects of Marcy using his entrepreneurial hustle and rap skills to go from selling drugs to selling CDs out of the trunk of his car to selling products at Macy's. This is what my colleagues and I call hip-hop genius, creative resourcefulness in the face of limited resources, or as it is often said in the hip-hop community, flipping something out of nothing. How can this audacious approach impact our education system? For starters, we need to exhibit the brash creativity of hip-hop's pioneers, just as hip-hop producers sampled songs from other genres, creating unique new sounds to please audiences' ears. Hip-hop educators can borrow from diverse models and improvise innovative blends of educational practices customized to meet students' needs. If that sounds too abstract, take a look at the High School for Recording Arts in Minnesota, where they've mixed project-based learning and competency-based assessment with artistic, vocational, and business training with dual enrollment at local colleges with a heavy dose of student leadership. We don't have to do the same thing that's been done before or follow one model. We can sample and mix multiple teaching techniques and school designs to find the blends that best serve our students. We also need to adopt the value hip-hop places on staying fresh. A hot beat yesterday was a hot beat yesterday. Whoever sets out to make a hot beat today has to do something new and different to remain relevant. The world is changing rapidly around us. The top 10 jobs in 2010 didn't exist 6 years earlier. Hip-hop's premium on freshness must permeate our schools. And we need to be resourceful. In the 1970s, thousands of families chose to replace their linoleum floors. In poor neighborhoods, the old linoleum was left in piles on the street. Young people, without access to playgrounds or dance classes, turned their parents' trash into dance floors and invented new moves like the windmill and the headspin to maximize its potential. Faced with our own resource constraints, educators need to find new platforms. What refuse could we be dancing on? And what are our new moves? Behind the mic, spray cans, turntables, and when it comes to their educations, students have brilliant ideas and instincts. Hip-hop genius is not just about teachers using hip-hop songs to get kids to succeed in traditional schools. It's about changing education to respect and build from young people's brilliance. It's about the incredible possibilities that occur when students are engaged, not as consumers, but as creators. We don't need to tweak the content inside existing traditional academic structures. We need to think outside the classroom and build institutions that are fundamentally more responsive to young people's interests and ingenuity. We need to create schools and school systems that not only teach hip-hop, they are hip-hop.
See if I can get back to my thing. A few weeks ago, I had the pleasure of having dinner with MC Light. Now the students will say, "Oh, wow," and the rest of you are going, "Who is MC Light?" She's arguably one of the most significant voices of hip-hop culture. And that dinner took place at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where Light has come to announce a partnership with our innovative First Wave program, the only spoken word scholarship program at a major university. Our first waivers had appeared on Broadway. They just come back from the Cultural Olympics in London during the London 2012 Olympics. and they just left Denver earlier this week after performing at the American Socio-political Association's conference. And one first wave student, Jasmine Mans, was named one of Glamour magazine's top 10 collegiate women. Jasmine has probably more hits on her YouTube websites than any of us in our classes can imagine. And this summer, she published a book, an undergraduate. We have this marvelous opportunity to engage with the most exciting generation of young students the world has ever seen. Their passions and desire merge with new and exciting technologies. They want teachers who will demand more from them than Googling some information and cutting and pasting it into a document. They want to do and they want to create. They want to inspire and they want to innovate. They want to learn to think critically and analytically. They want to be serious about education. Thank you.